intervention will be on knowledge, assessment, fairness, and equality of opportunity. Because just before developing my concern, it's clear that creative talents are based on knowledge and how to acquire knowledge and how knowledge is offered to you to develop your talents and your capacities to become creative talents. We had this afternoon a very important discussion about the notion of creativity and talents at individual level and also collective level. Because being a talent, when you are isolated in your capacities, is not sufficient. The challenge today of societies is to share, is to communicate, is to have capacity to dialogue and to build all together in a collective dimension our capacities and the creativity we have in our individual capacities. So first of all, the nature of knowledge. The notion of knowledge is particularly polysemous. In the present context, it is understood as a cognitive image encoding the behavior of an individual acting on the environment to change it. And creativity is exactly this capacity to act on the environment to change it. This is done with the aim of adapting to the constraints our environment imposes on our ability to survive. The environment is complex, made up of physical, biological, social, and especially as far as this analysis is concerned, cultural components. Forms of behavior and therefore of knowledge are processes that cannot be properly understood unless we simultaneously have knowledge of the input from the environment and the output of the environment. In fact, we need to begin by clearing up an ambiguity. Ordinary language does not distinguish clearly between the notion of process and that of the result of a process. In other words, between knowledge on the input-output relationship and that of output alone. We need therefore to observe output in its relation to each input in order to properly observe behavior, for it would seem impossible to detect any pattern in an individual's behavior by observing only output without taking input into account. Although an environment is made up of numerous physical, social, and cultural components, ordinary language tends to privilege in the idea of knowledge that aspect of it which encodes states of the social and cultural components of the environment. This meaning can be too restricted inasmuch as the components are too tightly interwoven to be disentangled. The particular type of knowledge we focus on in the analysis below is the type that encodes behavior acting on the cultural elements of the environment. It should not be forgotten, however, that given that human beings live in society, knowledge also encodes behavior involving the social components of the environment, and particularly behavior acting on other human beings and living organisms. Among them, the various kinds of behavior that transmit types of knowledge, starting with the behavior of imitation on the one hand, of learning on the other, are also encoded by types of knowledge of the transmission of knowledge. Trading in these strange commodities we call knowledge of one kind or another requires producers which are researchers, innovators and entrepreneurs, consumers, pupils and students, in fact, all human beings, and distributors, parents, teachers and lecturers. Each individual plays out these different roles at different times and to different degrees. From each of the actors, this trade demands trust, which can only be built up gradually. As soon as trust disappears, bureaucratic procedures and global rules flood in to simplify transactions in the knowledge market. First paragraph, the appetence for understanding, discovery, and learning. Today's students find it increasingly difficult to see and to believe that time spent at university could be of benefit to them. Professional activities, which increasingly fall within the service and cultural sector, no longer conjure up a vivid mental picture. And so, for many students, the effort of imagination needed for them to agree to expend their energies on studying for goals that are impossible to pin down is simply too great. The links between jobs and education have been broken owing to the gradual disappearance of specific jobs that always stayed the same and were clearly identifiable. Sorry for my English. I would have preferred to speak in French, but English is now the universal language. Without a clear picture of their future prospects, it is difficult to awaken in students that sense of calling which would make them engage with their studies. When one's faith in a better future is undermined, all that is left to replace it is blind obedience or the lure of gain, and that does not always produce the results hoped for. The inertia of knowledge. Human brains can no longer cope with the body of knowledge produced and stockpiled by their predecessors. For these reasons, a certain division of cognitive labor was established, giving rise to the creation of new disciplines. The knowledge is a discipline in a discipline is as inert as its history is long. The more deeply this knowledge is embedded in the collective memory and taught from early childhood, the stronger the consensus and the more widely it is shared, then the slower will be the transition to a new consensus on subscribing the new disciplines. This transition usually takes place only when the survival of the knowledge society is at stake, in a state of crisis. It is during such periods as these that reform and the adoption of reforms become possible. Redundancy and cultural diversity. Adaptation requires a reservoir of possibilities from which types of behavior can be drawn, and consequently the knowledge that encodes them. The dimension of this reservoir are determined by redundancy. Paradoxically, the evolution of redundancy can be impeded by an increasingly constrained and demanding adaptation to the environment, culminating in an ecological niche. In order to specialize, we have to activate an increasing amount of knowledge at the expense of the redundancy of the other elements of knowledge available, which diminishes over time. When the total amount of available knowledge becomes too small, the robustness of the cognitive system declines. Since our cultural environment is changing ever more rapidly, the situation could arise where there is not enough available knowledge to make the new environment viable. The phenomenon is analogous to the, I'm sorry for the term, totipotency of stem cells, which are not yet specialized and whose future is an open one, only gradually narrowing as they become more specialized to cope with unpredictable changes in the cultural environment in the wider sense. Redundancy leads to a bush-like evolution, from which the evolution of knowledge can mushroom and life can select those elements which it validates. Like life itself, which, as we all know, has favored biodiversity with notable success, cultural evolution must find an equivalent in a cultural diversity that would lead to a division of cognitive labor in the processes involved in making new discoveries. Writers experience this daily when they scribble down 1,000 ideas from which they will choose just one, so does a mathematician who makes calculation after calculation, until their aesthetic sense and the need for proof help them to choose the right formula. Decision makers, too, who meet for a brainstorming session in the course of which the one idea emerges, and politicians who always have several irons in the fire, the better to succeed in their ambitions. It is the redundancy in scientific and technological progress that allows human beings to increase both the production of different types of knowledge and the different types of human behavior. The mechanisms that have increased redundancy by creating ever bigger reservoirs of knowledge have been partially selected by humanity. As this process of exploration of the cultural environment unfolds, we will never fully appreciate the part played by error in our innovating and learning. Errors are, in fact, the source of any increase in the redundancy of knowledge, enabling an unintended exploration of the environment. Those errors, for example, and there are many, that punctuate the history of science, have enabled exploration of unexpected kinds of evolution, made possible as soon as the reservoir of possibilities contains a quantity of validated knowledge. Simply because the human mind fails to understand the phenomenon which happens when an error calls into question our confidence in the validity of a metaphor, this does not mean that we should throw out this phenomenon with the metaphorical bath water of understanding. It is preferable to experiment with, to explore, and to validate available knowledge. Now I come to a very important point, the evaluation of knowledge. The quest for excellence is a commendable objective, and if embarked on, requires procedures for assessing the knowledge exchange between the individual assessed and the assessor. The assessment task becomes unmanageable as soon as the quantity of knowledge and the number of individuals exchanging it reach too high a level for the assessment methods
particular to each exchange to be employed. The use of such methods becomes overcomplicated. Like any other commercial activity, dealing in knowledge entails the exchange of items of knowledge and ultimately their comparability either in terms of barter or in terms of marks that assess this knowledge, just as prices allows to assess products and to compare them one with another. Again, like any other commercial activity, knowledge and formal qualifications are subject to inflation and devaluation. As with money, bad qualification drive out good ones. In any case, paper qualifications are becoming less useful in finding a job or professional opening. They have to be supplemented by a whole battery of instruments, such as job interviews, personal statements, etc. This calling into question of the educational process after it has run its course could usefully occur earlier on at its source rather than downstream, so that the inadequacy of purely quantitative methods of assessment could be analyzed and supplemented by more plausible qualitative methods. Marking systems. Qualifications are supposed to measure knowledge. However, knowledge cannot really be measured in terms of marks, in other words, by numbers. Unlike goods and services in economics, which can in principle be measured quantitatively using objective units of measure, units of knowledge do not exist as such. To overcome this deficiency, human beings have invented theoretical units of knowledge that are subjective and psychological. Like prices in economics, systems for giving marks for knowledge, marking scales, have been devised and for the same reasons to ascribe to any body of knowledge a number that measures it and sums it up, not in terms of monetary value, but in terms of marks, used in the final analysis to quote the share price of a qualification on the job market. These marks are only real to the extent that a consensus is formed to believe in them. In this shifting world, faith in these assessment methods is all the more unshakable because it applies equally to the remuneration of job in the intangible sector, precisely the sector in which knowledge belongs. Since time can be measured, the speed with which tasks can be performed is often used as a way of measuring knowledge itself. Ironically, using time in this way causes us to overlook activities that demand reflection and so require us to take our time. One such activity is learning to learn. And this is an important aspect. We need to give time to time. And this is a formula which President Mitterrand, a former French president, used to tell me as a young president of Sorbonne University. He used to tell me, young professor, young man, give time to time. And this is an important message we should keep in mind. A kind of conspiracy has grown up to preserve the illusion that an objective number can represent the assessment of an individual's knowledge and to conceal behind impartial exterior methods that are fundamentally subjective. The perverse effects of marking systems. Every time, however, these methods of assessment have been accompanied by perverse effects, more damaging than such a time-honored practice might lead us to believe. The most serious, but the least advertised, is the necessity of devising or choosing the kind of knowledge that lends itself to being marked using that path for units of measure. The knowledge has had to be packaged and standardized so that it can be assessed quantitatively using a marking scheme. The ability to think, to reason, and to be original, to be creative, being difficult to assess, have been replaced by glib formula learned by rote, which can be applied automatically and are easily tested. Memory has taken over from reflection. Reacting to events has taken over from reflecting on them in an attempt to anticipate them. And dogma has taken over from doubt. The pleasure that rewards the effort to understand or to acquire new knowledge, satisfying one's curiosity, is replaced by the pride of getting high marks. Admittedly, marks encourage students to compete with one another and give them status in each other's eyes. But they also mean forgetting that the only worthwhile competition is competing against oneself, measured by one's own objective and with oneself as spectator. The use of multiple choice questionnaires have taken this mockery of an assessment system to deplorable extremes and perverted further the knowledge they are supposedly testing. Marks and qualifications have become the main objective of these workers in the knowledge industry that too many students are becoming in a society that expects to measure everything in units of currency. The lifespan of qualification. The lifespan of a qualification that prepares one for professions with a short life expectancy is becoming ephemeral because the skills learned have an ever shorter life. The qualification attached to these types of training should be stamped with a self-by date. Ironically, the training of this type of short-lived activity demands knowledge that is abstract and so general in nature and therefore shared by a large number of individuals, whereas a concrete experience is unique and can only involve a small number of experts. An individual initial education should therefore be extended by recurrent periods of training throughout that person's life. Since intellectual activity, unlike physical activity, cannot be measured, society will, for a long time to come, be strongly disinclined to reward activities which have to be taken on trust, trust being an attitude not often encountered. Trust in the value of qualification is in inverse proportion to the number of people who hold them, with the result that employers have very shrewdly introduced their own methods of assessing candidates' qualification and knowledge using their own criteria as the yardstick, keeping the role of teachers and examiners separate. When we observe, for example, that discussions about education focus more on marks, examinations, qualification, and employment prospects than on actual educational factors, is it not time to separate the roles of teacher and examiners. Separating the functions of teaching and assessing would allow professional examiners to benefit from bigger population samples for comparison, made up of both students and their teachers. The latter would be able to judge for themselves the effectiveness of their teaching by comparing over time the results of their students with those from earlier years. Teachers will also be able to concentrate their efforts on the transmission and the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Teachers then would concentrate their efforts on the transmission and the acquisition of knowledge and skills, and examiners would enjoy the advantage of unbiased assessment, qualitatively and quantitatively, working on bigger population samples. Teachers, for their part, would also be able to judge the effectiveness of their teaching by analyzing over time the results of their students and comparing them with those from earlier years. Such an arrangement would better enable examiners to advise students on changing courses where they had embarked on unsuitable degree programs chosen under the influence of fashion or of a perception, often erroneous, of the qualifications asked by employers in the public and the private sector. It would also create the flexibility necessary for correcting the overall nature of qualification, which is, after all, often called for at the national level and even at European and world levels. Individual and institution-wide evaluation. The global character of the evaluation of an institution makes it worthless precisely because it is global. It is difficult enough to evaluate individuals. It is even more of a challenge evaluating institutions which are educating them. Over the last 40 years, the pendulum has swung in varying degrees away from the individual towards the institutional in all countries. This system, described as modern in the sense of contemporary, does not mean it is a better one, that is to say, modern in the sense of progressive. After half a century, we have reached the following paradox. In a society that wants to become more and more individualistic, individual responsibility is being squeezed out. Of course, we should assess the players in teaching and research establishment, but individually, periodically, and seriously. Evaluation of institutions themselves should only look at governance, management, and the use of public funds, though individual evaluation could be available to public scrutiny. I now come to a paragraph concerning equality of opportunity in accessing knowledge. To ensure a minimum degree of fairness and improve equality of opportunity in terms of receiving an education and being equipped to adapt to the cognitive and digital revolutions, states felt it necessary to insist on all their young citizens being properly trained and to mutualize the cost by assuming it themselves. Through this redistributive pooling of public resources, states were at the same time providing the entire population with a longer education according to their means. Unfairness appeared at two levels, at least, between states themselves and between individual citizens within states. The interventionist deployment of funds to achieve these goals has been accompanied by a bureaucratic inflexibility, all the more restricting because of the large numbers involved. It has proved necessary to make adjustments either by decentralizing so as to respect the principle of subsidiarity, or else by privatizing this institution, thereby jeopardizing fairness and equality of opportunity. Towards the commodification of culture, policies for funding educational missions are essentially a matter for the state, but virtually everywhere private funding has begun to appear, initially somewhat timidly in Europe, but more boldly in North America and in some Asian countries, and Korea belongs to those countries. This has been happening since the late 1980s in particular, which experienced the silent revolution of unbridled deregulation, removing not just unnecessary restrictions, but a good many others as well. It hardly needs stating that too many restrictions limit the possibilities of change, but too few lead to all manner of excesses, like those which have caused the crisis of the early 21st century, a crisis which affects every sector, including education and research institutions. American universities, public as well as private, have developed an organizational structure of an entrepreneurial character which has given rise to a strongly competitive and often short-termist ethos. In this context, students become customers, the university's duty being to provide them with a service commensurate with the amount, often very considerable, of their tuition fees for which they are personally responsible. The competition is often intense. Some institutions have no hesitation in offering higher salaries and better working conditions to attract the most famous researchers and the best teachers. Involved in the running of this institution are financial experts in the field of economics, who are also engaged in fundraising activities. This commercial approach produces a very wide range of institutions, varying in both reputation and effectiveness. It means that each student, providing that they have the necessary means, can choose which university to apply to on the basis of the reputation of those particular universities that match their aspiration. This management style has borrowed from business the whole range of its techniques and has no hesitation in exploiting over and above the institution's academic quality, the different media and advertising to consolidate the institution's prestige. In the globalization process that is underway, this system is attempting to impose itself as the universal model, with all its qualities and excesses, particularly those relating to equity. I now come to, for UNESCO, a fundamental issue called education rights or education dues. Whether education is funded via the state or directly by its citizens, it is imperative that society increase its expenditure on teaching and research institutions. The number of individuals engaged in the knowledge business has gone on growing throughout human history, even though at different rates in different geographical locations, creating sharp differences both within individual countries and across countries. The rapid growth in student numbers after the Second World War had major repercussions. Society should make the education of its citizens a budgetary priority, starting with the education of parents and teachers, even though, and especially because, the effects will only be felt in the long term. The first task would be to shore up students' wavering faith in education and its benefit through a mechanism that was fair, motivating, and allowed them to take responsibility for their own learning. A system of financial credits properly devised would give students increasing freedom of choice as and when they wanted it. This inalienable, I don't know how to pronounce it, inalienable dues, different from the inalienable rights proposed by liberal economists in the wake of Milton Friedman, would be funded from the public purse. The dues would financially compensate the institution admitting a student for the actual cost of the course they selected, which would be less for Latin than for biology or physics, for example. The amount, which would be the same for all institutions, would be calculated on a yearly basis by the relevant government department. This capital sum, representing so many years of free tuition, could be used for successive years, at least in the case of the earlier years, or could be put aside for periods of recurrent training at a later stage. This is what we call lifelong education capacities. The credits would be limited to a specific number of years of free education fixed by government, for example. The number of years in question would have to be the same for every student in order to guarantee, as far as humanly possible, equality of opportunity. Attaching a time limit to these credits would require students to exercise personal responsibility. And this is also a very important aspect of personal responsibility of students, not to spoil the credit offered to them, encouraging them not to waste public money. If a student failed their course, use of the credit could be deferred, the student entering employment until they felt ready to return to their studies. As soon as this capital of 3 years of tuition guaranteed for every citizen was used up, the cost of the wasted period of study would be borne by the student if they wished to pursue their studies. Missing out financially, expressed in terms of credit as opposed to monetary units, would be more effective than failing an examination in reinforcing a student's sense of responsibility. This loss of credits may well be less effective than the loss of hard cash, which is felt more keenly, but it is fairer on those penalized. It also makes students much more aware of the cost of education. The fact that the allocation of this credit can be suspended for subsequent reuse after an early experience of the world of work avoids the trauma of being shunted into an educational siding and keeps alive the hope and possibility of picking up again at some later point the education program that is the due of every citizen. Above all, it allows students in their teens, a time when, for biological reasons, the pace of cognitive development is most likely to vary between individuals, to adapt at their own pace. Such dues should allow each student to apply to the institution of their choice, providing, of course, that the institution accepted them in accordance with its own admission criteria. They therefore promote two kinds of freedom of choice with regard to courses, the institutions and the candidates. The role of the local authority would be to allocate the resources that society devoted to education and research through taxation generally. Education funds would thus be distributed among institutions on a pro rata basis, depending on the number of candidates they admitted and calculated in terms of the actual cost of the course chosen by the student and its level. The financing of institutions would thus be dependent on the number of students they attracted and admitted and on the type of education and training programs they offered. This would give rise to a market without cash transactions, in which the student would be the consumer and the teachers and the examiners the producers. Each institution would then be able to determine its own policy for recruiting its staff and students. There should be no need for the public authorities to impose or to restrict the distribution of students among the different institutions through bureaucratic, centralized, and blanket rules. Such a mechanism would avoid the risk of identifying distribution as distinct from selection with exclusion, since everyone has a right to education. The threat of a financial penalty when the credits run out, providing it could be taken seriously by students, would replace the expectation of benefiting from a period of education that grew ever longer. Lastly, the mechanism would promote the principle of subsidiarity by delegating the management of education to institutions themselves. The Education Authority would undertake the task of working out the cost of each course, operating the credit system, and auditing the quality of an institution administration and teaching. It would also reserve the right under government supervision to promote any long-term goals that fell outside the scope of this type of market. So, some conclusion and recommendation. The above analysis is essentially concerned with the nature of knowledge and its evaluation, although it also touches on the subject of fairness and equality of opportunity. The questions raised by teaching and research methods on the one hand, and by structural and geographical problems on the other, will be dealt with later. This analysis has led to the formulation of the following proposals. First one, separation of teaching and research roles from assessment roles. Second, appraisal of individuals, occasionally by thoroughly and universally, but thoroughly and universally. Third, avoidance of the worst excesses of quality assurance. Fourth, individual assessments of research workers, qualitative, subject expertise, originality of research. Fifth, auditing of the governance of institutions. And sixth, reconciling equality of opportunity with student responsibility, education rights and use. And I think that when we address the notion of creativity and talents in creativity, we have to understand and to focus on the fundamental roles of institutions to offer each talent, and we all have individual talents, to express and to develop its creativity dimension. It's not a question of uniformizing and, minimizing the talent at a global level, but we have to help each one of you to express its own quality, its own talent, capacity. And this is a major challenge of higher education institutions, not to normalize the teaching, not to normalize the assessment of what you have acquired, but to give you the capacity to express your individual talents and also to express your individual talents in a collective dimension. Because when you how do we say, you recognize your own capacities, you have a major duty, is to ask yourself, how can I develop my talents and express my creativity, not only for my personal development and professional and creative development, but also how can I use this to serve my community, to serve my nation, and to serve my collectivity. And this is why it's important that university not only focus on individualities, but offer you this capacity to develop your collective dimension, especially in research. And I am myself a researcher. I have trained tens and tens of PhDs in different fields of activities based on mathematics. The major challenge for me was not to promote individual creativity, but to promote collective creativity at each individual level. And I've always asked my PhD students and researchers to create individually, but also to have this capacity to create collectively. And as I say, and we say in mathematics, the direct sum of individual creativity is not equal to the result of collective result. We have also to understand that some of us have capacities to work alone, and we have also to encourage this isolated capacity to work, but also we have also to encourage the capacity of each one of us to develop creativity in a collective and team dimension. This is a challenge for university, not to be individualistic in the way they address this issue, but also to have this collective dimension on which depends what a famous German mathematician used to, say, to mention, depends the adventure of the human spirit. The adventure of the human spirit is not an isolated adventure, it's mainly a collective adventure. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry to have been too academic in my presentation. You can read it, you can comment it, and I will be always at your disposal through my email at UNESCO to respond to your questions and answers. And I think that the 21st century will be the century not of individual talent, but of collective talent. Thank you.
Thank you for your patient lecture. Would you mind answering questions from the audience?
Yeah, oh, surely, it's better. This is what I wait for. May I say something to the students? This is what I said this afternoon. When I was a young man, I decided to devote my life to mathematics. Of course, mathematics. Are there some mathematicians in the... No. So, mathematics is a difficult issue. And when I was 18, my girlfriend was living in the south of France. And I used to visit her because I loved her, so I went to the south of France as often as possible. And one summer, when I visited her, she told me, and she asked me to come to a dinner party. And I was not interested to go to a dinner party, you can imagine. I was interested to stay with her alone. And she said, no, no, you won't regret it. Come to the dinner party and you will see, you will meet a personality, a very important personality. I was reluctant, but I accepted. So the dinner party took place and people were very nervous. They were waiting for someone, but nobody pronounced the name of this person. Then this man came late, 1 hour late, and he came like a king, you know, coming like that. And everybody was nervous, you know, speaking to him, etc. And this man, I can tell you his name, was Picasso. You know Picasso, the painter. And Picasso came and he had discussion with the people, but he was very upset. He was very nervous and he wanted to leave the party because he get annoyed. So he came to me and he said, young man, you are the only one who didn't ask something, ask question or try to dialogue with me. Why? And I said, because, you know, I am 18, I am a young mathematician, student, you know, and I didn't want to disturb a master like you. He said, you are wrong. I would like to have discussion with you. And during this time, the next 4 years before he died, we had discussion, regular discussion, and I met Picasso many times, and our discussion were about creativity and the role of institution concerning creativity. And he used to say, for art, me as a Picasso, as a creator in paintings, in art, I don't need an institution like a university. University would have destroyed my creative capacity. But you as a mathematician, especially in such disciplines which are abstract, difficult, you need an institution to protect you and to give you this capacity to express your creativity and your creativeness. So the role of institutions like universities are not to normalize or standardize the capacity of each individual, but also to promote the creative dimension. And Picasso used to tell me something which is very important, and I hope that you will retain what he told me. He told me, and this has been reproduced, this, I quote, until the age of 20, I have learned to paint and to draw like Raphael. You know Raphael, the painter of the Renaissance. From the age of 20, my only concern was to relearn to draw and to paint like a child. To learn to paint and to draw like Raphael, all the institutional teaching process, and then, after that, when you have this capacity, this creative dimension, to renew with this power you have inside, and which has partly disappeared through education and normative education, to learn again to be creative like a child, to be imaginative like a child. And I told him, so what you did until 20 was useless. He said, not at all, because I had to learn, I had to construct, to deconstruct. And the challenge of creativity is a permanent challenge of construction, deconstruction, construction, deconstruction. You have never reached the perfect level. You have to build all your way through education, etc., knowledge, building your knowledge capacity in a way of construction and deconstruction. Look at all the leaders at entrepreneurial, scientific level. They have always this capacity to construct and to deconstruct. They have this capacity to be confident in their own abilities, not only to take knowledge as granted, but also to take knowledge, to build their own capacity to deconstruct what they have got, to become creative. And creativity is a permanent balance between construction and deconstruction. And this is what I hope for you, that what you have learned at school is only the platform for your deconstructive capacity to construct your own creative talents.
혹시 질문할 거 있으세요?
There is no stupid question. Huh? Please ask questions. Yeah, of course. And before I finish, don't make me forget to tell you an anecdote, which is important for you. Okay, I listen.
네, 일단 강의는 감사하다는 말씀 드리고 싶고요. 그리고 저
I can answer in Korean if you want, but nobody will understand. Huh? Ah, okay, thank you. Sorry. Please.
일단 답변 너무 감사했고 지금 제가 드릴 질문이 본 감염과는 좀 관련이 없는 질문인데 이 질문을 드려도 될지 먼저 양해를 구하고 있습니다.
Ah, modern technology, so nothing. Try it before. Huh? No, it's good now. It's good. It's working now. Sorry, could you?
일단 강연 너무 감사했고 제가 지금 드릴 질문이 본 강연과는 좀 관련이 없는 내용인데 제가 이 질문을 드려도 될지 먼저 양해를 구하고 있습니다.
This question is not related to this lecture. Are you okay?
Yes, of course. Is it a question or? No, it comes from the other room, I think. So what is the question? Ah, yes, now, yes.
드디어 질문을 하게 되어서 참 기쁩니다. 네, 예전에 책을 보면서 프랑스
Yes?
Is it working now? 예전에 책에서 읽었는데 프랑스의 2차 세계대전기에 나치 부역자들에 대한 강도 높은 처벌과 그리고 또 프랑스 해방 정부의 대부분의 주요 인사가 레지스탕스 출신이었다는 걸 읽었습니다. 그런 같은 아픈 역사를 가진 한국인으로서 되게 부럽기도 하고 많은 감명을 받았습니다. 근데 지금 제가 얼마 전 뉴스를 보다 보니 당시 2차 세계대전 당시에 프랑스 경찰 총책임자로 있던 사람이 나치의 유대인 학살에 관한 거기에 관련했다는 그런 증거가 새로이 발견이 돼서 그 사람에 대한 재판이 수십 년이 지난 지금 다시 이루어진다고 그렇습니다. 근데 이 사건에 대해서 어떤 사람들이 예전이면 수십 년 전 일인데 왜 굳이 꺼내서 이런 평화라 그런 좀 안정성을 해치느냐 이런 말이 많습니다. 근데 이 사건에 대해서 프랑스인에 대한 지식인의 한 분으로서 어떻게 생각하시는지 그리고 또 프랑스는 내 여론이 어떻게 형성이 되었는지 보십시오.
It's a very important question because, first of all, I would like to tell you I'm a Jew myself, but a Jew from North Africa. So my family has not suffered the Nazi camp and the Holocaust, what we call the Shoah. But I think that there is no future without memory and recognition of the past. A country has a future when it has capacity to address its past and the memory and the action it has undertaken. And this is what's important when you mention this World War II period and the collaboration aspect of the French nation in support of the Nazi system, it was very important for the reconstruction of France to address this issue. And this issue cannot be addressed immediately. We need time to analyze and to give history this capacity to be analyzed, etc. France and many other countries like Germany, etc., and mainly Germany, have addressed in a relevant way this issue. And they have recognized their responsibilities. And for that reasons, whatever they have done, and nothing can justify what the Nazi system has produced as in a barbarian dimension, but for this reason of recognizing their historical responsibilities, this country have regained a kind of legitimacy, a kind of recognition and pride. Some countries, I don't want to mention, one not too far from here, have difficulties to recognize the past and their responsibilities in the past. And I think that we have to help them. And this is a worldwide aspect where UNESCO should play a fundamental role, is to help each country to apologize and also to have an in-depth analysis of its history, its responsibilities, especially when this country have destroyed communities, have destroyed human beings, never destroyed human pride, because human pride is undestroyable, whatever you do, but through colonialistic, imperialistic activities, you have, countries have done disastrous activities and effect on these countries. So I think that the future depends on this capacity to address the past and the history. If I could advise you to read one book, it's to read the book written by a famous Austrian writer called Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig, Z-W-E-I-G. And the title of the book is The World of Yesterday. Die Welt von gestern. I don't know if you speak German. The World of Yesterday. And it shows how much the world of yesterday could be the world of today and the world of tomorrow if we don't address the issue of responsibilities, individual and collective responsibilities. And this is where universities play their role through historic teaching, historic addresses of the nation and collective responsibilities. We have also to understand that there is no future without memory. This is what we call at UNESCO the memory of the future. All human and social and collective dynamic process are not immediately dependent on time t. They are past dependent and history dependent. We have to understand how history affects the behavior of individuals and communities today and for the future. And this is one of the messages we have to address. In France, we did this work, not perfectly. It's never too late. It's never too late. And I think that the world community should help some countries who have so many difficulties to address their responsibilities in what their ancestors and their elder parents have done in history.
교수님께 실례되는 질문이지만 되게 열심히 되게 좋은 대답 해주셔서 감사하다고 말씀해 주시죠.
다음 질문하실 분.
Hello. I'd like to ask a question regarding education and creativity. Do you hear me?
Yes.
So what I want to ask is, because you mentioned Picasso who wishes to draw like a child, like his philosophy is to go back to like the primitive stage of art and to draw with like a pristine form of art and everything. I think that's how I understood it. But then when it comes to creativity and education, what is given to the children is like basic knowledge is given to the children. To some extent, restriction is sort of
Yeah, it's a very important question which will be raised, I think, through eternity. How much and how long and what concern? What Picasso said, and I go back to Picasso, I'm finishing a book I'm writing on Picasso because I promised him to write a book about what we discussed, and the title, I can give you the title, is Picasso Told Me about this. He said, deconstruction doesn't mean destruction. You need to learn. Otherwise, why can you deconstruct if you don't construct? If you don't accumulate knowledge? But there is one point where you should promote individual freedom, freedom of expression, of creativity, and this is one of the challenges of school and educational system. They are too normative. Don't forget that school measure, this is what I said in the marking system, they want to measure what you have learned. But what you have learned is not necessarily what you have fully integrated to expand yourself, to expand your dimension, creative dimension, intelligent dimension. And this is a paradox of school. It's a normative system of giving marks, giving through examination, etc. This is why I propose to separate teacher and examiners, to give more freedom to each of them and to contribute to this system and to allow more creativity in the sense of freedom of expression and freedom of deconstruction of what you have learned and constructed. But this is a permanent. We live in a society where we need to have normative instrument, normative levels, you know, of level. But this is a challenge of each society to rethink in a permanent way the education system to promote not only abilities, professional abilities, competitive abilities, but also capacities for all of us to be part of the creative dimension of the human adventure. The human adventure is not only an adventure of reproduction of knowledge, it's not an adventure of uniformization of knowledge. The human adventure is an adventure of creativity and this critical capacity to make knowledge advance and progress. For example, in mathematics, we know that in mathematics, if you know too much, if you learn too much, you lose your creativity. Don't forget that the Nobel Prize in mathematics, the Fields Medal, is given before the age of 40. Because creativity needs this capacity of expression which could be destroyed by a heavy educational system. And this is why I think that education should be considered not only in a short-term period or dedicated term period, but in a lifelong capacity. You have to go to university in a regular way, following your needs, following your will, your wishes, you know, and not only go to university for a period, you get your diplomas, and then you forget university for all over your life. I think university should be a place and a platform for permanent education, permanent learning, and also to develop new knowledge and new capacity to construct for you deconstruction, not destruction. Deconstruction means a creative approach of the constructive dimension you have developed. And this is a permanent challenge, but of course it has economics impact, it has regulation impact, it has normative influence, and of course in societies today, in a globalized world, where access to education now is expanded, it's a real challenge because the economic dimension have to be considered. But I think that we have to, in a permanent way, to rethink the educational challenges and objectives. So it's not a good answer, but I have no solution today. It's a permanent process.
Last one question.
The lady.
교수님의 희망적 메시지에 대해서 잘 들었습니다. 그리고 또 여러 가지 교수본부
Yeah. Now your question, of course, and I don't want to fall in, how do we say, traditional answers. For me, you are not different. You have differences. We are all different. We are all different in our ways. And this apparent disability could offer you some abilities we don't have, you know, because it's not only a sensitive aspect of abilities, but the human spirit adventure is not a visual or a tactile adventure.